Wyoming Territory, June 1879. The wind was sharp that morning, even under the rising sun, when Boone Reddick lowered himself from the saddle and stood at the edge of the burned-out homestead that used to be his life. The ash had long since gone to dust, but he still came back every year. Same day. Same time. The morning his world ended, his wife, Clara, and their 6-year-old boy, Levi, had been inside when lightning struck the roof. He had been in Laramie, 3 days' ride south, hauling lumber. He never forgave himself for being late. Boone knelt in the tall grass, his hat pressed to his chest, and let the silence settle heavy. He never cried here. He had done that already year after year until grief hardened into something quieter. But this morning, something different pulled at his gut, a sound, small, quick, out of place. A gunshot cracked from somewhere west, then another closer. Boone stood and reached for the Winchester in his saddle's scabbard. He moved without thinking, years of frontier instinct guiding him through the brush. He crossed the ridge fast but careful, boots silent on the earth. He found the trail. Fresh wagon ruts dug into the dirt, wheels wobbling like the driver had lost control. A few yards down, he caught sight of the wagon itself, half-tipped, one wheel splintered, canvas torn. 2 bodies lay near it. Men, shot clean through, bandits, and then he heard her. "Please," the voice was faint, broken. From under the wagon, Boone raised his rifle, eyes scanning fast. Nothing moved beyond the trees. Crows circled but kept their distance. He crouched low and moved to the back of the wreck. A woman lay half-curled beneath the shelter of the broken axle, her dress torn at the hem, blood dried across her brow. Her hands trembled as she tried to reach for something that was not there. Boone lowered his weapon and crouched. "You hurt?" she blinked, eyes wide and unfocused. "They took her." Boone leaned in. "Who?" "My daughter," she whispered. "They took her. Please, her name is Lottie. She is only 5. Boone's blood ran cold. He pulled her out gently, lifting her like glass. She was light, too light, her skin scraped and bruised. "What is your name?" She looked up at him, breath unsteady. Geneva Callahan." "I am Boone," he said, voice quiet. "I will get your little girl back." She clutched his sleeve, nails digging in. "You swear it?" He looked her dead in the eyes. "I swear it." Boone built a quick shelter in the trees, just out of sight of the wreck. Geneva was too weak to ride, so he left her with water and wrapped her in a blanket from his saddle roll. She tried to argue, but her voice broke, and he pressed his hand to hers. "I will bring her back. You stay alive for her." He found the tracks easy enough, 3 horses, one smaller, probably carrying Lottie double. Boone rode hard, following the trail north into the foothills. Hours passed, no rest, no food, just grit and the steady beat of hooves. Just before dusk, he found them. The men had made camp in a narrow canyon. They were loud, careless, passing a bottle and laughing. And there, tied to a tree, was a little girl with copper curls and a tear-streaked face. Boone waited until one stumbled off to piss. That one never came back. He moved like a shadow, inch by inch. When the second bandit turned his back, Boone stepped out and fired once, then again. The third man ran, but Boone dropped him before he reached the edge of the canyon. Lottie screamed when the last shot rang out. Boone dropped his rifle and raised both hands. "It is all right," he said gently. "I am a friend. Your mother is safe." She stared at him, trembling. Then she nodded. He cut her loose, scooped her into his arms, and held her close. "You are safe now." That night, Geneva woke to the sound of hooves. She sat up fast, heart racing, and there he was, Boone, walking toward her, carrying Lottie in his arms. The little girl reached for her mother, and Geneva let out a gasp that turned into a sob. Boone knelt and let Lottie climb into Geneva's lap. They held each other like they had both been drowning. Boone stepped back, unsure where to look. He turned to tend the fire. "Boone," Geneva said, her voice shaking, "you saved her, you saved me." He just nodded, throat too tight to speak. 2 days later, after tending Geneva's wounds and burying the men near the broken wagon, Boone rode with her and Lottie to the nearest town, Cedar Hollow. It was a small place, little more than a few buildings and a church, but the doctor there patched Geneva up right. Boone rented a room at the boarding house next to the mercantile. Geneva and Lottie took the room across the hall. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she could figure out her next step. But days turned into weeks. Boone found work hauling goods for the store. Geneva helped the seamstress in town and started teaching Lottie letters in the shade of the cottonwood near the well. One evening, Boone came back late, dust in his hair, sweat streaking his shirt. Geneva was on the porch, rocking slow, Lottie asleep in her lap. "You look like you walked through the sun itself," she said softly. He smiled at that, then sat on the steps. "I do not mind the heat," he said. "It is the quiet I like." Geneva looked down at Lottie, brushing a curl from her face. "She sleeps easier now since we got here," Boone nodded. "She is safe now." Geneva looked up at him. "So am I." She reached out, her fingers brushing his. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned his hand and laced their fingers together. Neither said a word, but they stayed like that until the stars came out. The first snow came early that year, brushing the rooftops of Cedar Hollow in a thin coat that melted by noon but left the air sharp as a blade. Boone had taken to rising before dawn, chopping wood behind the boarding house while the town still slept. Geneva would sometimes watch from her window, unseen, the glass fogging faintly with her breath. She'd begun sewing with Mrs. Penfield full-time, turning bolts of muslin and calico into dresses and shirts for the families scattered across the valley. Most evenings, she brought her stitching to the porch, where Boone joined her when he finished his deliveries. Lottie perched nearby, wrapped in a quilt, humming tuneless songs to her doll. That night, Geneva had a cramp in her wrist and a growing ache between her shoulder blades. She leaned back in her chair and glanced at Boone, who sat beside her with his hands resting on his knees, eyes following the last light as it slipped behind the hills. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked, voice low. Boone didn't answer right away. A wagon passed on the far end of the street, wheels creaking, a lantern swinging from the driver's side. Then he said, "I used to think I'd ride south. Montana, maybe, or over the mountains to Oregon, but I never got far." Geneva folded the hem of her work and set it in her lap. "What kept you?" He looked at her, not with the heaviness he used to carry, but something steadier. "Ghosts don't follow you, they just wait wherever you end up." Lottie had fallen asleep again, her head against Geneva's side. Boone rose and lifted her gently, careful not to wake her. Geneva opened the door to their room, and he laid the girl down on the cot near the window. He stood for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from Lottie's cheek before stepping back outside with Geneva. She closed the door softly and joined him under the awning. "You ever wonder what it'd be like starting over?" she asked. He tilted his head. "I reckon we already are." They walked down the steps together. The street was empty, save for the flicker of gaslight from the saloon windows and the faint sound of someone playing a fiddle inside. The music didn't reach them whole, just broken pieces floating on the wind. Geneva hugged her shawl tighter. "Lottie's been asking about school, says she wants to read books like the ones I keep on the shelf." Boone smiled with just his eyes. "Reckon she'll learn quick." "She's got her mother's fire." Geneva looked sideways at him. "You don't know much about me yet." "I know enough." She stopped walking. "What do you know?" He turned to face her, his breath curling in the cold. "You don't scare easy. You keep going, even when you got nothing left to hold on to. And you love that little girl like the world could end if you didn't." Geneva stared at him a long moment. "That's more than most saw in me before." Boone reached out, tucked a loose thread from her shawl back into place. His hand lingered just a moment too long, then dropped. They walked back slowly. The porch groaned under their boots as they stepped up. Boone turned toward his door. "Boone," she said. He looked back. "Would you stay for supper tomorrow?" He nodded once. "I'd like that." The next evening, Geneva cooked what she could from the pantry, cornmeal biscuits, stewed beans, and jerked venison she'd traded for at the mercantile. Lottie set the table with mismatched plates. Boone arrived with a jar of huckleberry preserves and a quiet smile. They ate with the lantern burning low, the shadows soft against the walls. Lottie chattered about the book Geneva had started reading to her, something about a girl in the woods with a fox for a friend. Boone listened, laughed once or twice, and helped clear the dishes after. Later, when Lottie had crawled beneath her quilt and the lamp was turned down, Geneva stepped onto the porch with Boone. She leaned against the post. "It's been a long time since I cooked for someone." Boone folded his arms. "It's been longer since someone fed me without expecting anything back." Geneva looked at him. I didn't do it to be kind. I know. She watched him for a beat longer. I did it because I wanted you here. The words hung between them, warmer than the lamp glow behind the curtains. Boone took a step closer. Then I'm glad I came. Neither of them moved after that, not away, not closer, just stood there, side by side, while the wind stirred the edge of her shawl and the scent of wood smoke curled down from the hills. The frost stayed longer on the window panes come November, clinging in delicate webs that Lottie traced with her fingertip each morning before sunrise. Geneva had taken to lighting the stove early, warming the room so her daughter wouldn't wake shivering. Boone, without a word, had begun splitting extra logs before his own chores, stacking them behind the kitchen door without knocking. That morning, Geneva found him in the alley beside the boarding house, sleeves rolled, breath rising in quiet puffs. She hesitated at the corner, watching him drive the axe into a thick round of pine, the rhythm sure and steady. "You always work before breakfast?" she asked, keeping her voice low. He set the axe aside. "I don't sleep much past first light." She stepped forward, pulling her shawl tighter. "I didn't mean to pry, just noticed." Boone wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt. "You weren't prying." She looked down at the ground, then back up. "There's a schoolhouse being built east of town. Reverend Ellsworth came to me about helping once it's open." "I said I'd think on it." His brow lifted slightly. "You want to teach?" "I used to, before I married. My father ran a school in Illinois and I helped him after I turned 16. It's quiet work, but it matters." Boone leaned against the fence, watching her. "You should do it if it brings something back to you." She looked at him, really looked. "What about you? What brought you here to begin with?" His jaw shifted, like he was weighing the shape of the truth. "I was heading nowhere. This place happened to be in the way of that." Geneva didn't smile. "You don't speak of them?" He didn't ask who she meant. After a pause, he said, "There's not much left to say, but I remember how my boy used to shout when he saw snow, like the whole world had turned just for him." She nodded. "Lottie does the same." He glanced away, then back. "I see that." Later that week, Boone borrowed a wagon and took Geneva and Lottie out past the river bend, where the cottonwoods thinned and the prairie opened wide. Lottie rode up front between them, pointing out mule deer tracks and crow feathers caught on low branches. They stopped in a clearing where the grass still held some gold beneath the frost. Geneva laid out a cloth and unwrapped boiled eggs, bread, and dried apples she'd packed in a tin. Boone wandered off a ways and came back with a crooked branch, which he handed to Lottie with great ceremony. "For what?" she asked, eyes bright. "Snow stick," he said. "When it snows proper, you use that to measure how deep it gets." She held it like a treasure and ran off to poke it into the soft ground. Geneva watched her daughter, then said quietly, "You're good with her." Boone shrugged. "I just follow her lead. She trusts you." He looked out toward the hills. "That's not something I take lightly." They ate in silence after that, not out of discomfort but ease. The kind that grows when words no longer need to fill every space. The sun dipped low by the time they packed up. Geneva walked beside Boone as Lottie skipped ahead, humming to herself. "I've thought about moving on," Geneva said. "I won't lie, there's places I've yet to see." Boone kept his eyes ahead. "You still mean to," she glanced at him. "Not anymore." He stopped, just off the trail. "Why not?" She faced him, voice steady. "Because I've come to care for someone here, someone who's quiet and stubborn and carries more than he lets on, and I don't want to leave that behind." Boone didn't speak. He reached up and brushed a leaf from her hair, his fingers lingering only long enough to feel her breath catch. She stepped closer. "You said once you were heading nowhere," she whispered. "Maybe now you're not." He nodded, slow and sure. "No. I'm not." They stood that way as Lottie called from ahead, waving her snow stick like a banner. Geneva laughed under her breath and turned to follow, Boone beside her. The air smelled of cold earth and pine. The wagon waited just beyond the ridge, and the road back to Cedar Hollow stretched behind them, quiet and certain. December settled in with a hush. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself so much as seeped into your bones and stayed. Cedar Hollow slowed with it, less laughter in the street, fewer wagons on the road. Folks huddled close to hearths and kept their eyes on the sky, watching for real snow. Geneva started teaching in the church parlor on Wednesdays, just for the children too small to walk all the way to the school site. Reverend Ellsworth cleared the benches and brought in his wife's old chalkboard, and Geneva strung up letters on twine across the windows. Lottie sat front row, proud as a preacher's daughter, her hands always the first to rise. Boone didn't talk much about it, but he came by near the end of each day, leaning against the rail outside with his hat low and his arms folded. He never went in, never asked how it went, but Geneva felt the weight of his gaze through the glass, steady as the mountains. One afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the steeple and the children scattered homeward, Geneva stepped outside into the brittle air. Boone was there, as always, a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. "You bring trouble or supper?" she asked, brushing chalk dust from her skirt. He shifted the sack and opened it enough to show a jar of pickled beans and half a loaf wrapped in cloth. "Depends how hungry you are," he said. She smiled and walked beside him down the lane. "You always this generous?" Boone shrugged. "Only when I've got more than I need." They passed the livery, where 2 horses waited under thick blankets, breath smoking in the cold. Geneva slowed as they reached the edge of the pasture behind town, where the creek ran thin and half frozen. "I used to think I'd never feel safe again," she said quietly. "Not really, not down to the marrow." Boone didn't answer. She looked up at him. "But lately I've been sleeping through the night." He nodded, the gesture small but sure. They stopped near the fence where the wind cut through the tall grass. Boone leaned on the top rail and looked out. Geneva stood beside him, her hands wrapped in wool. "You ever think of marrying again?" she asked. He turned slowly, his face unreadable in the fading light. "Not until now." Geneva didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for promises." Boone's jaw worked, but his voice came quiet. "I never thought I'd have the one again. Didn't think it could live in me." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "And now," Boone met her gaze, "now I want to build something that doesn't burn." Geneva reached up, her hand resting against his chest. "Then stay, not just in the room next door. Stay with us." He took her hand without hesitation, pressing it against his heart like it anchored him. "Every day you'll have me," he said. "If you'll take me." She nodded, eyes brimming. "We will." That night, Boone packed his few things and moved them across the hall. There wasn't much a change of clothes, a shaving kit, and a carved wooden horse he'd made years ago but never could bring himself to part with. He placed it on the shelf beside Lottie's books. Geneva made room in the drawer for his shirts. Lottie, half asleep, climbed onto his lap as he sat by the stove, curling against him like it had always been her place. Boone wrapped the quilt around her and held her until her breaths came slow and even. The wind howled outside, but the room stayed warm. Geneva sat nearby, her mending forgotten in her lap, just watching the two of them. Boone caught her eye and held it. "Feels like home," he said. She nodded. "That's because it is." Snow began to fall just before dawn, not a flurry but a real storm, thick and silent. The sort that blanketed everything in a fresh start. When Lottie woke and pressed her nose to the window, she squealed and ran to wake Boone. He pulled on his boots and carried her outside, helping her plant the snow stick in the drift beside the porch. Geneva followed, wrapped in her shawl, laughing as she watched her daughter measure the world with wide eyes and pink cheeks. They stood together under the gray sky, the 3 of them, and there was no ache in Boone's chest for what had been. Only the solid weight of a small hand in his and another at his side, and the quiet certainty that this time this life was the one that would hold. By mid-January, the river had frozen deep enough for wagons to cross. The whole valley quieted under the weight of snow, and time moved slower, measured more by the sound of wood crackling in stoves than by clocks or bells. Geneva began teaching 2 days a week at the new schoolhouse once the walls were raised and the stove fitted. Lottie stayed close by her side, sledding with the other children during recess, cheeks flushed and full of laughter. Boone spent his days hauling supplies from the rail station in Rawlins, twice a week now, earning enough to keep a mule and rent a small parcel beside the old miller's barn where he'd begun building with his own hands. He didn't speak of it until he'd laid the foundation himself, but Geneva found the plans he'd sketched with pencil stubs on a scrap of feed sack paper: 2 rooms, a loft, a front window that would catch the morning sun. One evening, when Lottie had fallen asleep early from too much sledding, Geneva sat beside Boone on the porch of the boarding house. She wore a wool dress he hadn't seen before blue, faded at the seams but mended with care, and her boots were dusted with snow. "I saw what you're building," she said softly. He rested his forearms on his knees, watching the last light fade across the ridge. "I didn't want to speak of it until I knew it would stand." She leaned toward him. "Why now?" He didn't answer right away. "Then I want you to have a place that's yours, not borrowed, not waiting to be taken away." She studied his profile, the way the wind pressed against his coat but couldn't touch the set of his shoulders. "You already gave us that the day you came back with her in your arms." His voice came low. "That was just returning what never should have been lost." Geneva reached for his hand, cold and rough from the day's work. "You've given us more than safety, Boone." He looked at her then, eyes steady on hers. "I want to give you a name you can carry like a shield." "If you'll have it." She didn't hesitate. "Yes." He drew her hand to his lips, the kiss light and certain. No more questions hung between them. They were married in the back room of the church on a Wednesday when the wind had finally calmed and the sky turned clear. Reverend Ellsworth's wife brought a bouquet of dried lavender and pine. Lottie wore a ribbon in her hair and stood between them, holding both their hands as Boone made his vow: no guests, no music. Just the three of them and two witnesses from town. Geneva wore the same blue dress and a quiet smile that didn't need to stretch wide to be felt. Boone wore his cleanest shirt and combed his hair back with water. When the Reverend said the words, Boone's voice didn't tremble. After the ceremony, they walked home in the hush of snowfall, boots crunching on fresh powder. Geneva carried Lottie, who had fallen asleep with her head on her shoulder, worn out from excitement. Boone walked ahead, lantern in hand, lighting the way. That night, Boone carried Geneva over the threshold of their new home, still smelling of fresh timber and smoke. The walls were bare, but their coats hung on the peg by the door, and the stove glowed warm in the corner. He set her down gently, and she turned to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "You built this with your hands." "I built it with you in mind," he said. She kissed him then, slow and certain, her fingers threading into his hair. He held her like he'd waited a lifetime to do so, without fear of losing it all again. No ghosts lingered in that room, only the creak of wood settling and the quiet of two hearts learning to beat together. They shared their bed that night wrapped in quilts, her breath against his collarbone, his hand resting at her waist. No words passed between them after the lamp was turned down. They didn't need them. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that filled rather than emptied. Geneva planted herbs in clay pots along the windowsill. Boone added shelves made from scrap pine where she placed her books and sewing basket. Lottie had her own corner with a small table and a stool Boone had carved down to size. One evening, Geneva stood by the window, brushing Lottie's hair as the snow tapered off outside. Boone watched them from his chair by the fire, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. She caught his eye, and something warm passed between them, easy and unspoken. "You still think the ghosts will follow?" Geneva asked, voice low. He shook his head. "I think they stayed behind. Spring came late that year, but when it did, wildflowers cut through the thawed earth like tiny promises." Boone planted beans in the yard, and Geneva taught Lottie how to spot edible greens in the woods near the creek. The three of them picnicked on Sundays, folding blankets over damp grass and letting the sun find their faces. Boone never again spoke of the fire that had once taken everything. Geneva never asked, but some nights when the house was still and the wind brushed against the walls, she'd feel him draw her close and hold her just a little tighter. And she'd press her lips to his shoulder and know he was home. They grew into each other without rush. Boone built a barn that summer, and folks in town lent hands without him needing to ask. Geneva took in mending for extra coin, but she kept her afternoons for Lottie, who had begun reading aloud from the books they once only traced with fingers. Their days filled with harvests and small joys, a pie cooling on the sill, a new dress stitched from leftover fabric, the sound of Lottie's laughter skipping through the yard. It was never grand, but it was true. In the stillness of their evenings, when the fire had burned low and the shutters were latched, Boone would rest his hand over Geneva's as they lay side by side, her head on his chest, Lottie breathing sweetly 2 rooms away. And they knew, without ever needing to say the words, that they had made something whole where once there had only been ruin. A life not built to outrun sorrow but to outlast it, together, always.